By the time the last bolt was tightened and the engine turned over with a clean, deep-throated roar that echoed across the valley, no one was laughing anymore. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of money lost, reputations shattered, and a lesson learned so hard it would be passed down for generations in that small farming community. But they were all laughing on the day it began, the day a 14-year-old boy named Wyatt Carver walked through the shimmering glass doors of the regional John Deere dealership alone, with nothing but the ghost of his grandfather on his shoulder and a folded, yellowed piece of paper in his pocket. They laughed because he looked small and out of place, a sparrow that had wandered into a hawk's nest. They laughed at his worn boots and his earnest expression. They laughed loudest of all when he pointed a steady finger not at the glittering million-dollar titans on the main floor, but at the forgotten iron dinosaur rusting in the back lot, a machine everyone else had already dismissed as scrap. The laughter was a sharp, cruel sound in the cathedral of green and yellow steel, but it was a sound that would not last. For in his pocket, Wyatt Carver carried more than just a piece of paper. He carried a key. He carried a debt. He carried a promise. And by the time he was finished, the price of that laughter would be calculated in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, a figure so staggering it would change the very ledger of power in that county forever. The dealership was a monument to modern agriculture, a place that smelled of new tires, fresh paint, and the faint, clean aroma of high finance. It sat on the edge of town like a fortress, its vast plate glass windows reflecting the endless blue of the prairie sky. Inside, the floor was polished to a mirror shine, and colossal machines stood in silent, orderly rows, their green and yellow hides gleaming under the recessed lighting. These were not mere tractors or combines. They were technological beasts, bristling with GPS domes, sensor arrays, and cabins that looked more like the cockpits of starships than farm equipment. Their price tags, displayed on discrete digital stands, contained more zeros than most people in the county saw in a decade of harvests. This was a place for men with calloused hands and ironclad credit, men who spoke in terms of bushels per acre and futures markets, men who arrived in new Ford F-350s with checkbooks thick enough to stop a door. It was a serious place for serious men. Into this arena of wealth and power walked Wyatt Carver. He was 14, but a lanky, still-growing 14 that made him look younger. He wore blue jeans that were clean but faded to the color of a pale sky at the knees, a plain gray t-shirt, and a pair of work boots that had been his father's and then his grandfather's. The leather was scuffed and scarred, peeling back from the steel toe on the right foot like a tired smile. He moved with a quiet, deliberate economy that was at odds with the nervous energy of most boys his age. He did not gawk at the giant S780 combine that dominated the center of the showroom. He did not run his hands over the pristine paint of the 9RX tractor with its 4 massive tracks. Instead, his eyes, a shade of blue as serious and deep as his grandfather's had been, scanned the room with a focused intensity, looking past the spectacle for something specific. He carried no wallet. He had no phone. In his left hand, he held a small metal-banded flashlight, the kind a mechanic uses, its lens clean and its body heavy with D-cell batteries. His right hand was in the pocket of his jeans, curled around a small folded square of paper that felt as familiar to his fingers as a worry stone. He was alone. His mother had offered to come, her face etched with a concern she tried to hide, but he had gently refused. This was something he had to do himself. It was a matter of honor, a final errand for a man who was no longer there to run it. The salesman, clustered near a coffee station with its gleaming chrome carafe, noticed him immediately. They were a flock of peacocks in their crisp green-collared shirts, their names embroidered in yellow thread over their hearts. They saw the boy, and a subtle shift occurred in their posture. A shared, knowing smirk passed between two of them. One, a younger man with gelled hair and an aggressive smile, detached himself from the group and began to saunter over, his movements radiating the predatory confidence of a cat approaching a mouse. He saw an easy dismissal, a bit of sport before the real customers arrived. "Can I help you, son?" the salesman asked. His voice was slick with a practiced, condescending warmth. His name tag read Rex Thorne. "Looking for a toy for the sandbox? We've got some great scale models over by the parts counter." Wyatt's eyes finally left the far corner of the showroom and met Rex's. He did not smile. He did not flinch. He simply looked at the man, his gaze steady. "I'm not here for a toy," he said, his voice quiet but clear, without the reedy uncertainty of adolescence. "I'm here to see the 9500. Rex's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The 9500. He had to rack his brain for a moment. It wasn't one of the gleaming floor models. It wasn't in their premium used inventory. Then it clicked. The trade-in from the AgriCorp conglomerate, the old dinosaur, the one sitting out back, cannibalized for a few spare parts and destined for the scrapyard next week. It was a 20-year-old machine, a relic from a different era of farming, an analog beast in a digital world. Rex's practiced smile returned, wider this time, dripping with amusement. He glanced back at his colleagues, who were now watching with open interest, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, as if to say, "Get a load of this." "The 9500, Rex repeated, drawing the words out. "That's a big machine for a little guy. Your dad sending you on an errand? Is he thinking of picking it up for parts?" He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Because, between you and me, that's about all she's good for." "My dad's not here," Wyatt said, his expression unchanging. "And my grandfather's gone. I'm here for myself. I'd like to inspect it." The word inspect was what did it. It was a man's word, a buyer's word. And coming from the mouth of this skinny kid in worn-out boots, it was so absurdly out of place that Rex Thorne let out a short, sharp bark of laughter. The other salesmen, taking their cue, chuckled along with him. The sound was ugly in the quiet, cavernous space. "Inspect it," Rex chuckled, wiping a fake tear of mirth from his eye. "All right, Inspector, tell you what. The machine's out in the boneyard. You can go have a look, but don't get your hopes up." He then delivered the line that would hang in the air between them, a line that would curdle and sour and come back to haunt him for the rest of his days. He placed a patronizing hand on Wyatt's shoulder, a gesture of false magnanimity. "Son, this is a showroom, not a playground. We deal in real machines and real money here. Come back when you've got more than pocket change." Wyatt did not shrug off the hand. He did not argue. He did not flush with anger or embarrassment. He simply stood there, absorbing the insult, his quiet dignity a shield the salesman's mockery could not penetrate. He let the laughter wash over him. He had been expecting it. His grandfather had warned him about men like Rex Thorne, men who saw the world through a lens of price tags and appearances, men who could read a balance sheet but couldn't read a man or a boy, men who confused silence with weakness. "I'd still like to see it," Wyatt said, his voice as steady as before. Rex, defeated by the boy's unnerving calm, finally sighed and waved a dismissive hand toward the back of the dealership. "Fine, go play. Door to the yard is past the service bays. Just don't touch anything that might fall on you." As Wyatt walked away, his back straight, his steps measured, the laughter bubbled up again behind him, a little quieter this time, but no less cruel. He didn't look back. He pushed open the heavy steel door and stepped out into the blinding sunlight of the back lot, the hot prairie wind whipping at his shirt. The door swung shut behind him, cutting off the sound of their amusement. He was alone now, in a graveyard of iron, and that was exactly where he needed to be. The boneyard was a world away from the pristine showroom. It was a place of rust and weeds where discarded implements and tired machines awaited their final judgment. Here, the smell was not of new paint but of sun-baked dust, hydraulic fluid, and the slow metallic decay of iron returning to the earth. A dozen pieces of forgotten farm history were scattered across the gravel lot. A faded red cultivator with bent tines, a planter with its seed boxes cracked and open to the sky, the skeletal frame of a hay baler. And there, at the far end, separated from the rest, sat the John Deere 9500 combine. It was a giant, even by the standards of the day it was built. Its green paint was faded and peeling, blistered by 2 decades of sun and hail. Patches of orange rust bloomed along the edges of its sheet metal panels. The huge grain head, the part that actually cut the wheat, had been removed and lay on blocks beside it, its cutting teeth dull and broken in places. One of its massive front tires was flat, the rubber cracked and gray, causing the whole machine to list to one side like a wounded beast. It looked tired. It looked finished. To the salesman inside, it was a liability, an accounting problem to be solved by a man with a cutting torch. To Wyatt Carver, it was beautiful. He walked a slow circle around it, his eyes taking in every detail. He wasn't looking at the rust or the flat tire. He was reading the machine's story. He saw the weld marks on the unloading auger, a clean, professional repair. He saw the aftermarket reinforcement on the rear axle, a common and intelligent upgrade for that model. He saw the faint outline of a farm's name stenciled on the side, just beneath the layers of dust and grime. Carver Farms. It was almost completely faded, but he could see it. His heart gave a single hard thump against his ribs. This was it. This was his grandfather's last machine, the one he had been forced to trade in when Agricorp bought out the last of their land lease. This was not just about buying a combine. This was about bringing a part of his family home. He felt the weight of his grandfather's memory settle over him, as warm and familiar as a wool blanket. He could almost hear the old man's voice, a low, rumbling murmur that always seemed to carry the scent of motor oil and coffee. Silas Carver had been a man forged from the soil he worked. He was not a large man, but he had a presence that filled any room he entered. His hands were a roadmap of a life spent with tools and iron, his knuckles thick and scarred, his fingernails permanently outlined in black grease, a mark he wore with more pride than any suit. He believed in three things above all else: God, his family, and the immutable truth of a well-maintained machine. "You don't just listen with your ears, Wyatt," Silas used to say, his hand resting on the boy's small shoulder as they stood in the cool, dusty cavern of their workshop. "You listen with your hands. You listen with your eyes. Every machine tells a story. It tells you where it's been, who owned it, and whether they respected it. A loose bolt tells you about a lazy operator. A clean engine tells you about a proud one. The iron never lies. People do, banks do, but the iron, it always tells the truth." Their workshop had been Wyatt's true schoolhouse. It was a long, low building behind the old farmhouse, smelling of damp earth, welding smoke, and the 50 years of accumulated knowledge that hung in the air. The walls were lined not with posters, but with pegboards holding generations of tools, each one cleaned and returned to its precise, painted outline after every use. There were wrenches that had belonged to Wyatt's great-grandfather, their steel dark and smooth with age. There were modern pneumatic tools and diagnostic computers that Silas had grudgingly but expertly mastered. And there was the library. Against the far wall, taking up a space of honor, stood a row of heavy-duty metal shelves, and on those shelves, in 3-ring binders of every color, was the life's work of Silas Carver. It was his gospel. Each binder was dedicated to a single piece of equipment he had ever owned or serviced for a neighbor. The spines were neatly labeled in his blocky, precise handwriting: JD 4440 tractor, Case IH 1660 combine, New Holland 1033 bale wagon. Inside each binder was a universe of detail. Every oil change was recorded, with the date, the engine hours, the brand of oil, and the filter part number. Every repair was documented with a narrative of the problem, the diagnosis, the parts replaced, and the time it took. Tucked into plastic sleeves were the receipts for every part, every bolt, every gallon of fluid. And, most importantly, stapled to the inside back cover of each binder were the technical service bulletins, or TSBs, that John Deere and other manufacturers sent out to their dealers and master mechanics. Silas had a contact, a friend who worked in the warranty department at a dealership 2 counties over, who would mail him copies of every bulletin. They were his secret weapon. While other farmers might scratch their heads over a recurring problem, Silas would retreat to his workshop, pull a binder, and find the answer in the dense technical prose of a TSB that detailed a known manufacturing flaw or a newly designed replacement part. "They don't advertise this stuff, boy," Silas had explained one evening, tapping a thick finger on a bulletin. Wyatt, then 10 years old, was sitting on a stool beside him, watching intently. "This here is the company admitting they made a mistake. They'll fix it, but you got to know to ask. You got to know the right part number, the right bulletin number. They count on most folks not knowing. They count on laziness. A man who doesn't read is a man who's asking to be cheated. You remember that. You read everything. The fine print on a loan, the service manual on a new Bowler. You read it all. Knowledge isn't just power, Wyatt. It's armor. The memory was so vivid that Wyatt could almost smell the coffee on his grandfather's breath. He had spent hundreds of hours in that shop, poring over those binders. He learned to read wiring diagrams before he could properly parse a Shakespearean sonnet in school. He understood the intricate dance of pistons and valves, the complex choreography of a hydrostatic transmission. He learned the language of machines, a language of tolerances, torques, and pressures. It was a legacy passed down not through a will, but through grease-stained pages and late-night lessons under the bare bulb of the workshop light. And it was a legacy born of pain. Wyatt was only 8 when the letter came. It was from Agricorp, the massive agricultural conglomerate that had been buying up family farms all over the state. They had acquired the land his family had leased for 3 generations. The lease would not be renewed. They had 90 days to vacate. He remembered the silence in the kitchen that night, a silence heavier and more terrible than any storm. He remembered the look on his grandfather's face, a look of quiet, profound defeat that carved new lines around his eyes. They didn't lose the farm because of bad luck or a poor harvest. They lost it to a clause in a contract, a piece of paper his great-grandfather had signed 50 years earlier, a detail no one had thought to re-examine. They lost it because they hadn't read the fine print. The lesson was brutal, and it seared itself into the family's soul. Silas Carver never fully recovered. He sold off most of his equipment piece by painful piece to pay off debts and secure a small plot of land with a house and his precious workshop. The last and best machine to go was the 9,500 Combine, traded into the very dealership where Wyatt now stood. Silas got pennies on the dollar for it from a slick salesman who talked about market depreciation and the cost of transport. The salesman's name had been Rex Thorne. Silas passed away in the spring, just as the first green shoots were pushing through the cold earth. It was a quiet, peaceful end to a life of hard work. The day after the funeral, Wyatt's mother had found him in the workshop, sitting at his grandfather's heavy wooden workbench. He had a single binder open in front of him. It was the binder for the John Deere 9500. He had been reading it for hours, his finger tracing the lines of his grandfather's handwriting. He had looked up at his mother, his young face set with a man's resolve. "I'm going to get it back," he'd said. She had started to argue, to explain the impossibility of it, but then she saw the look in his eyes. It was Silas's look, the look of a man who had found his purpose. So instead, she had simply nodded, her heart aching with a mixture of pride and fear. For the next 2 months, Wyatt spent every spare moment preparing. He did odd jobs for neighbors, mowing lawns, fixing small engines, mucking out stalls. He saved every dollar in an old coffee tin, the same one his grandfather had used. It wasn't much, not nearly enough to buy a combine, but it was a start. But the money was not the plan. The plan was in the binder. Late one night, tucked into a dusty plastic sleeve at the very back, he had found it. It was a TSB from 1998, just a year after the Combine was built. It was Bulletin 98-B-4. The title was innocuous. Update to main hydraulic pump assembly for 9500/9600 series combines. But the text was explosive. It detailed a catastrophic design flaw in the primary pump that could lead to a complete failure of the hydrostatic drive system. Because the failure could happen without warning and posed a significant safety risk, the company had issued a mandatory lifetime recall. The bulletin stated, in clear, unambiguous language, that John Deere would cover the full cost of a replacement and upgraded pump assembly, a job that required a specialized crane and nearly 40 hours of a master mechanic's time. It was a repair that, in today's dollars, would cost upwards of $50,000. Wyatt had cross-referenced the serial number ranges listed in the bulletin with the original bill of sale his grandfather had meticulously saved in the binder. The combine sitting in the boneyard, his grandfather's combine, was on the list. Then he had gone a step further. He had found his grandfather's detailed service logs. There was no entry for the hydraulic pump replacement. Silas, for all his diligence, had either never received this particular bulletin or had traded in the machine before the problem ever manifested. The recall work had never been done. The machine that Rex Thorne and the other salesmen saw as a $20,000 piece of scrap was, in fact, a $50,000 liability on their books, a liability they were legally obligated to fix at their own expense. Wyatt had carefully made a photocopy of the bulletin and the relevant page from his grandfather's logbook. He folded it neatly and put it in his pocket. That was his armor. Now, standing in the shadow of the great machine, he felt a calm settle over him. The laughter of the salesman seemed a distant, irrelevant noise. He was no longer a boy in a graveyard of iron. He was a man with a purpose, standing on hallowed ground. He clicked on his flashlight, its bright focused beam cutting through the afternoon glare, and got to work. He didn't start with the engine or the cab. He started at the rear of the machine, as his grandfather had taught him. "Start where the work ends," Silas would say. "The back of the machine tells you how hard it worked. The front tells you how well it was driven." He lay on his back in the gravel and shimmied under the massive rear axle. The air was hot and smelled of baked dirt. He ran his hand over the axle housing, feeling for stress fractures. He found none. The aftermarket reinforcement was solid, the welds clean and professional. Good. He moved to the straw choppers and the chaff spreader. The blades were worn, but evenly. That meant the belts had been kept at the proper tension and the bearings were likely sound. He made a note in a small, spiral-bound notebook he'd pulled from his back pocket. Chopper blades worn. Belts appear serviceable. He wasn't just looking for flaws. He was building a complete picture, a story. For the next hour, he moved around and under and through the combine with a methodical patience that would have astonished the men inside. He ignored the obvious cosmetic flaws, the rust, the peeling paint, the dented panels. That was just skin. He was looking at the bones, the heart, the sinews. He pulled open the side panels, exposing the labyrinth of belts, chains, and hydraulic lines. He used his flashlight to peer into the dark recesses of the engine bay. The engine block itself was caked in a layer of oily dust, but it was a dry dust. There were no fresh, wet streaks of leaking oil or coolant. He checked the dipstick. The oil was old and black, as expected, but it was at the proper level. He climbed the small ladder to the operator's platform. The cab was a time capsule from the late 1990s. The seat was cracked vinyl. The radio was a simple AM/FM cassette deck. And instead of the sleek touchscreens of the new models, the console was a forest of analog gauges, toggle switches, and levers. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight piercing the grimy windows. He sat in the seat. It sagged slightly to the left, the same way his grandfather's favorite armchair had. He ran his hand over the controls, his fingers finding the familiar shapes. He could feel the ghost of his grandfather's hands next to his. But his primary focus, the true purpose of this inspection, was hidden deep in the machine's belly. He climbed down and went to the right side, just behind the massive front wheel. There, behind a heavy access plate held on by 6 large bolts, was the heart of the machine's power, the main hydraulic pump and the hydrostatic transmission. This was the component from the service bulletin. This was the smoking gun. He didn't have the tools to remove the plate, but he didn't need to. He knew what to look for. He lay on his side, his cheek pressed against the hot, dusty gravel, and aimed his flashlight into the small gap between the frame and the housing. He angled the beam just right, and there it was. He could see the original factory part number stamped onto the pump casing. It was the number from the bulletin, the flawed number. The pump had never been replaced. He took a deep, slow breath. The trap was set. The proof was confirmed. He had them. He spent another 10 minutes making a show of checking other, less important components, jotting notes in his book. He kicked the good tires. He tugged on the drive chains. He was performing for an audience he knew was watching. Through the dusty window of the service bay, he could see the silhouette of Rex Thorne, arms crossed, watching him with an expression of bored impatience. Good. Let him watch. Let him think this was all a child's game. Finally, with a sense of finality, he closed his notebook, tucked his flashlight into his back pocket, and walked back toward the showroom. He schooled his face into an expression of neutral, slightly disappointed consideration. He was no longer just Wyatt Carver, the boy. He was a negotiator. He was his grandfather's son. When he stepped back into the air-conditioned chill of the showroom, the atmosphere had shifted. The other customers, the serious men, had arrived. A well-known farmer from the next county over was in deep conversation with the dealership manager. Two other salesmen were showing off the features of a new planter. Rex Thorne, however, was waiting for him, his arms still crossed, a smug smirk plastered on his face. "Well," Rex said, his voice loud enough for the nearby customers to hear. "Finished with your playground adventure? Did you decide if the rust is the right shade of orange for you?" Wyatt ignored the jibe. He looked past Rex toward the combine rusting in the yard. "It's in rough shape," Wyatt said, his voice projecting a calculated disappointment. "The left front tire is shot. The grain head needs a new sickle bar, probably a dozen new teeth. The straw chopper blades are gone, and she's got at least 200 hours on her since the last oil change." Rex's smirk widened. The kid knew a few terms. He'd clearly been coached. This was even more amusing than he'd thought. "You don't miss a trick, do you? A regular farmhand. So I guess it's a no-go then. Thanks for wasting my time." He started to turn away, dismissing him completely. "I didn't say that," Wyatt said, his voice stopping Rex in his tracks. "I'm still interested, but not at the price you've got listed." Rex turned back slowly. The listed price on the internal inventory sheet, which he assumed the boy couldn't have seen, was $22,000. A fantasy number, meant as a starting point for negotiation with a hopeful part scavenger. "And what price did you have in mind, Mr. Expert?" he asked, the sarcasm thick as molasses. Wyatt paused, letting the silence hang in the air. He looked at the floor, as if doing a difficult calculation. He was playing a role now, the role of a boy, and over his head, trying to make a deal. Finally, he looked up, his eyes wide with a carefully feigned innocence. $500, he said. The silence that followed was of a different kind. It was a silence of pure, unadulterated shock. Then came the explosion. Rex Thorne threw his head back and roared with laughter. It was not a chuckle. It was a deep, bellowing guffaw that echoed through the entire showroom. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. The farmer talking to the manager looked over, an annoyed frown on his face. Rex, oblivious, slapped his knee. $500, he wheezed, tears of mirth now genuine. 500. Kid, I've got tires on the floor worth more than that. You're killing me. You really are. Wyatt just waited. He let the man have his moment. He stood there, a small, still island in the storm of the man's ridicule. When Rex finally got his breath back, he wiped his eyes and leaned in close to Wyatt, his voice a low, menacing hiss. "Listen to me, you little punk. This isn't a joke. You've had your fun. Now get out of my showroom before I have you thrown out for trespassing. Your inventory sheet says the asset has a depreciated book value of $2,000, Wyatt said calmly, and it's scheduled for scrap pickup next Tuesday. The current scrap price for mixed steel is about $180 a ton. That machine weighs about 13 tons. That's $2,340. Your book value is already a loss. If you sell it to me for $500, you're still losing money, but you're saving the transport fee to the scrapyard, and you're $1,900 better off than you will be on Wednesday morning." Rex's face went slack. The numbers were right. The kid had either seen the inventory sheet, which was impossible, or he'd done his homework. The reference to the scrap appointment was unnervingly specific. The laughter died in his throat, replaced by a cold nod of irritation. The game was no longer fun. The mouse was refusing to act like a mouse. "How do you know that?" Rex demanded, his voice dropping the pretense of amusement. "My grandfather taught me to do my homework," Wyatt said simply. A flicker of something, annoyance, maybe even a sliver of respect, crossed Rex's face before being replaced by his usual arrogance. He had underestimated the kid. Fine, he could still control this. In fact, this was perfect. The kid wanted the junk heap. He wanted to pay $500 for it. Rex had been authorized to let it go for as low as $3,000 to a legitimate parts dealer. Selling it for $500 to a know-it-all kid was an insult, but a profitable one compared to scrap. He could get rid of the machine, make a fool of the boy who thought he was so smart, and still come out ahead of the scrapper. He would make the kid sign an as-is, where-is contract so ironclad that when the machine inevitably fell apart, the boy would have no recourse. It was a beautiful, petty, and profitable solution. Rex's slick smile returned. "All right, kid, you're a sharp negotiator. I'll give you that. You've got a deal." He clapped his hands together as if sealing the greatest bargain in history. $500. As is, where is. No warranties, no returns, no help getting it off the lot. You buy it, it's your problem. Do we have an agreement? "We do," Wyatt said, "on one condition." Rex's eye twitched. "What now?" "I want the bill of sale to list the machine by its full model number and its vehicle identification number," Wyatt said, "and I want it signed by you and by the dealership manager." This was an unusual request, but not an unreasonable one. It was just paperwork. For a legal transfer of title, it was technically required anyway. Rex saw it as the boy trying to puff out his chest to make the deal feel more official. It was pathetic, and it cost him nothing. "You got it, hotshot," Rex said with a magnanimous wave of his hand. "I'll draw up the papers right now. You got the cash?" Wyatt nodded. He didn't reach for his pocket. Not yet. Rex strode over to his desk, a triumphant smirk back on his face. He was going to enjoy this. He pulled out the official bill of sale form, the multi-part carbon copy paper, and began to fill it out with a flourish. He deliberately wrote in large, clear letters, 1-1, John Deere, 9,500 combine harvester, sold as ES where is, with no warranty expressed or implied. He found the vine from the trade-in paperwork and carefully transcribed it. This was the moment the trap, so carefully laid by Silas Carver's legacy, was about to be sprung. By putting the specific VIN on the official bill of sale, Rex was legally tying the dealership to that specific machine and all its history, known and unknown. He was creating the very legal chain of evidence Wyatt needed. He brought the form over to the dealership manager, a portly, balding man named Mr. Henderson, who was still talking to the wealthy farmer. "Dave, I need your signature on this," Rex said, interrupting them. "Just clearing out that old 9500 from the boneyard." Henderson, annoyed at the interruption but wanting to get back to his important client, barely glanced at the paper. He saw the as-is clause, saw the low price, and shrugged. Clearing junk off the books was always good. He scribbled his signature without a second thought. Rex walked back to Wyatt, the signed document in his hand. He felt a surge of victory. "All right, Inspector, last chance to back out." "I'm not backing out," Wyatt said. "Then sign on the dotted line, and the big toy is all yours," Rex said, his voice dripping with final condescending triumph. He slid the paper and a pen across a small table. "No takebacks." Wyatt picked up the pen, but he didn't sign. He just held it, poised over the paper. He looked up at Rex, his blue eyes clear and calm. "Before I sign," he said, "there's just one more thing." Rex let out an exasperated sigh. "What is it?" This was the moment, the culmination of 2 months of planning, of a lifetime of lessons learned in a dusty workshop. Wyatt's hand finally went to his right pocket. The salesman, who had been watching the drama unfold, leaned in. They expected him to pull out a crumpled handful of bills from his coffee tin savings. They expected him to be short, to give Rex one last chance to humiliate him. But what he pulled out was not money. It was a single sheet of paper, a photocopy folded into a neat, tight square. It was yellowed and worn at the creases. He carefully unfolded it and laid it on the table next to the bill of sale. It was the TSB, Bulletin 98-B-4. Rex stared at it. It was covered in dense technical text and diagrams. It looked like gibberish to him. "What's this?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Your homework?" "It's a technical service bulletin from John Deere Corporate, dated 1998, Wyatt said, his voice as level and steady as a surveyor's tool. "It concerns a mandatory lifetime recall on the main hydraulic pump for the 9500 series, combines within a specific serial number range. He tapped a finger on the bill of sale Rex had just filled out. A range that includes the VIN you so carefully wrote down on this document. Rex's face was a mask of confusion. Recall? So what? The machine is 20 years old. It's sold as is. That paper doesn't mean a thing. An as-is clause covers wear and tear, Wyatt said, his voice taking on the patient, instructional tone of his grandfather. It doesn't cover pre-existing manufacturer-acknowledged defects that constitute a safety recall. That's federal law. A mandatory recall, especially one involving a safety issue, has no expiration date. The obligation to perform the repair transfers with the ownership of the machine, and the obligation falls to the authorized dealer who possesses the machine at the time the claim is made. He paused, letting the words sink in. That would be you. Rex just stared at him, his mouth slightly agape. The words made sense, but the implication was so outlandish, so impossible, that his brain refused to accept it. This had to be a bluff, a fantasy concocted by a child. "You're crazy," Rex stammered, finally finding his voice. "That's not how it works. You can't just bring in a piece of paper and demand a $50,000 repair on a piece of scrap I'm selling you for $500. He snatched the paper up, his eyes scanning it desperately, looking for the flaw in the boy's logic. He couldn't find it. The language was technical, but the summary was clear. Just then, a new figure entered the scene. He was an older man, in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair and a face as weathered as an old barn door. He wore greasy green coveralls, and he was wiping his hands on a red rag. It was Gus, the head mechanic, the one man in the dealership who had been there for 40 years. He had known Silas Carver. They had shared coffee and swapped stories about stubborn engines for decades. He was walking toward the parts counter when he saw the commotion. Rex saw him, and a wave of relief washed over him. Gus would know. Gus would shut this kid down. "Gus!" Rex called out, his voice a little too loud, a little too shrill. "Perfect timing. Come over here. You're the expert." Gus ambled over, his expression wary. He had no love for Rex Thorne. He'd seen a dozen salesmen like him come and go, all polish and no substance. "Take a look at this," Rex said, shoving the TSB into the old mechanic's hands. He was smiling again, a brittle, desperate smile. "This kid seems to think this piece of paper entitles him to a brand new engine or something crazy like that on that old clunker out back. Tell him how it really works." Gus took the paper. His eyes, accustomed to reading fine print on schematics, scanned the document. He didn't read it quickly. He read it with the slow, deliberate care of a man who knows that details matter. As he read, a profound change came over his face. The weary indifference was replaced by a dawning awareness, then a flicker of disbelief, and finally, a slow, spreading look of absolute astonishment. He looked from the paper to Wyatt, and for the first time, he truly saw the boy. He saw the set of his jaw, the seriousness in his eyes. He saw Silas Carver looking back at him. He lowered the paper. He didn't look at Wyatt. He didn't look at Rex. He looked at the floor for a long moment, as if gathering his thoughts. The entire showroom had gone quiet. Mr. Henderson and the wealthy farmer had stopped talking and were watching intently. The other salesman stood frozen. The only sound was the low electric hum of the lights. Finally, Gus lifted his head and looked directly at Rex Thorne. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a sharpened blade. "Rex," he said, his voice raspy with disuse, "this is Bulletin 98-B-4. It's a mandatory factory recall. The company covers the full cost of the powertrain replacement." He paused, and every person in the room held their breath. Gus then delivered the final devastating blow, the sentence that would bring the entire house of cards crashing down. "We're on the hook for the labor." Silence. A profound, absolute, and terrible silence fell over the John Deere showroom. It was not an absence of noise, it was a physical presence. It pressed in on them, sucking the air from the room. It was the sound of a smug smile, freezing, cracking, and falling to the floor in 1,000 tiny pieces. It was the sound of money, a vast sum of it, evaporating into thin air. It was the sound of a 14-year-old boy's quiet, methodical victory. Rex Thorne's face went completely white, the color of bone. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked from Gus's grim face to the unreadable expression of the boy, to the signed bill of sale on the table. The bill of sale that legally bound him to this specific machine. The bill of sale that was now a $50,000 time bomb. Mr. Henderson, the manager, finally broke the spell. He strode over, his face a thundercloud. "What the hell's going on here?" he demanded, snatching the TSB from Gus's hand. He read it, his lips moving silently, his face growing darker with every line. He looked at the bill of sale he had so carelessly signed. "Rex," Henderson said, his voice dangerously low. "Did you know about this?" "No, of course not. How could I?" Rex sputtered, his voice cracking. "It's a 20-year-old bulletin. It's ancient history." "It's not history if the work was never done," Gus said quietly, his gaze still fixed on Rex. "And any dealer is supposed to run the VIN for outstanding recalls on any trade-in, especially a major one. It's page 1 of the handbook, Rex. Did you run the VIN?" Rex couldn't answer. His eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, an ally. He found none. The other salesmen were staring at their shoes, distancing themselves from the unfolding disaster. The wealthy farmer was watching with a look of grim fascination. He had just witnessed the public execution of a man's career. The full weight of the situation crashed down on Rex Thorne. He hadn't just been outsmarted by a child. He had been caught in a catastrophic failure of his own professional duty. His arrogance, his laziness, his dismissal of the boy as an insignificant pest had led him to skip the most basic step of due diligence. He had walked himself and the dealership right into a financial minefield. Wyatt Carver, the architect of this beautiful destruction, finally picked up the pen. With a steady hand, he signed his name on the buyer's line of the bill of sale. Then he reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He unzipped it and carefully counted out 25 crisp $20 bills, the sum total of 2 months of hard labor, and laid them on the table. $500. "I believe this is yours," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He pushed the money, the signed bill of sale, and the TSB across the table toward Mr. Henderson, whose face was now a mottled shade of purple. "I'll arrange for transport of my combine tomorrow." The word "my" hung in the air, a declaration of ownership so total and absolute it was shocking. He had not just bought a machine, he had reclaimed a piece of his family's soul. But the fallout was just beginning. Mr. Henderson, a man who understood the language of liability far better than Rex, saw the abyss that was opening up. A mandatory safety recall, a failure to perform due diligence, a sale made under false pretenses, even if they were his own. The legal exposure was immense. But then, a darker thought surfaced. He looked from the TSB to Rex's pale, sweating face. "Gus," Henderson said, his voice cold as steel, "how many 9,000 series combines have we taken in on trade over the last few years?" Gus thought for a moment. 4, maybe 5 from the big outfits. "And did we ever perform this service on any of them?" Gus shook his head slowly. "Not that I recall. We usually just flip them or send them to auction." Henderson's eyes narrowed. He turned to Rex. "Rex, you handled the AgriCorp trade-ins last year. There were 2 9600s. Did you check them for recalls?" Rex began to stammer, but Henderson cut him off. He walked over to a computer terminal and began typing furiously. He pulled up the service histories for the machines they had sold at auction. He cross-referenced their VINs with the recall bulletin. A low groan escaped his lips. Both of them were on the list. 2 machines, sold to 2 different smaller farms with a known, dangerous defect. 2 ticking time bombs for which his dealership was still legally on the hook. The potential liability had just tripled. "You didn't check them, did you?" Henderson whispered, his voice shaking with fury. "You just polished them up and sent them down the road." The truth was even worse, and Wyatt, standing silently by, knew it. His grandfather had taught him not just about machines, but about the men who sell them. He had told Wyatt stories of shady dealers who would discover an open recall, perform the work, bill the manufacturer for the thousands of dollars in parts and labor, and then, instead of informing the customer, They would charge the customer for the same repair, effectively getting paid twice for the same job. It was a particularly insidious form of fraud. Wyatt suspected Rex Thorne was not merely lazy, he was a predator. As if on cue, the wealthy farmer who had been watching the whole affair finally spoke up. His name was Frank Miller, a man known for his sharp mind and his even sharper tongue. "You know, Dave," Miller said to Henderson, his voice calm and conversational, "that's a funny thing. I bought a used 9,600 from you folks 2 years ago. From you, actually, Rex." He looked at Rex, his eyes cold. "Had a problem with the hydrostat last fall, right in the middle of soybean harvest. Rex here told me it was a common issue, that the whole pump assembly was shot. He quoted me $45,000 for the repair, said he was giving me a deal on the labor." The room went dead silent once more. "I paid it," Miller continued, his voice hardening, "because what choice did I have? My crop was in the field, but I always wondered about it. Seemed mighty steep for a machine I'd bought from a certified dealer." He looked at the TSB in Henderson's hand. "I'd be willing to bet my farm that my machine's VIN is on that list." Henderson didn't even need to check. He knew. The look on Rex's face was a confession. The man hadn't just been negligent. He had been a thief. He had been charging customers for warranty work, defrauding both them and the company that employed him. The single act of a 14-year-old boy, armed with his grandfather's knowledge, had just pulled the pin on a grenade that was about to blow Rex Thorne's life and the dealership's reputation to smithereens. Henderson walked slowly back to Rex, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He stopped directly in front of him. "Rex," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion, "get your personal effects from your desk. You have 5 minutes, then I want you off my property." "Dave, Rex began, his voice a pathetic whine. "Now," Henderson commanded. He then turned to the other salesmen, who were frozen in a state of horrified shock. "The rest of you back to work. This conversation is over." He then turned to Wyatt. His expression softened, just slightly. The anger was replaced by a look of weary, grudging respect. He looked at the boy, then at the $500 on the table, then at the bill of sale. He knew he was legally trapped, but he also knew he was witnessing something extraordinary. "The labor on that repair," Henderson said, his voice heavy, "is going to cost me close to $10,000. The parts will be another $40,000. You just bought a $50,000 combine for $500. Wyatt simply nodded. Henderson let out a long, slow breath. He looked past Wyatt toward the service bay where Gus was standing, watching. "Gus," he called out, "clear a bay. We've got a $9,500 to rebuild, and bill the full labor amount to my office, top rate." He looked back at Wyatt. "Congratulations, son. You've got yourself a combine." As Rex Thorne, his face ashen, shuffled toward his desk to collect his things, a pariah in the room where he was once a king, Wyatt did one last thing. It was a small gesture, but it was perhaps the most important one of the day. He walked over to Frank Miller, the farmer Rex had cheated. "Mr. Miller," Wyatt said quietly, "my grandfather, Silas Carver, kept records of everything. He has binders on almost every machine in this county. I think he might have one for your 9600. If he does, the original bill of sale and his service notes might help you with your situation." Frank Miller looked down at the boy, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. He reached out a large, calloused hand. "I'd like that, son," he said. "I'd like that very much." He shook Wyatt's hand, a firm, respectful grip. "Your grandfather was a good man. It seems he taught you well." Wyatt nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He had done it. He had honored his grandfather's memory. He had not only reclaimed a piece of their past, but he had also dispensed a perfect poetic justice. He had used the very knowledge born from his family's pain to dismantle the man who had profited from it. He turned and walked toward the glass doors, his step no longer just deliberate, but light. As he pushed the door open and stepped back out into the bright afternoon sun, he heard Mr. Henderson's voice, sharp and cold, cut through the showroom one last time. It was directed at the disgraced figure of Rex Thorne, who was fumbling with a box of his personal belongings. "Rex!" Henderson said, his voice ringing with a final damning judgment. "You were right about one thing." Rex looked up, a flicker of pathetic hope in his eyes. "This is a showroom," Henderson said, his voice dripping with ice, "not a playground." Wyatt didn't look back. He kept walking, the hot prairie wind feeling like a benediction on his face. He had a combine to bring home. The story of that day spread through the county like wildfire. It was told over coffee in diners, over beers in dusty taverns, and over the crackle of CB radios in tractor cabs. The details grew with each telling, but the core of it remained the same. The quiet boy, the arrogant salesman, and the folded piece of paper that had changed everything. Wyatt Carver became a local legend overnight. He wasn't just the boy who had bought a combine for a song. He was the boy who had stood up to the system and won, armed with nothing but intelligence and integrity. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, Mr. Henderson had Gus and his team drag the old 9500 into the main service bay. It was a monumental task. They had to inflate the flat tire, which hissed and moaned in protest, and then carefully tow the listing behemoth into the shop. Once inside, it looked even more like a relic, surrounded by the gleaming, computerized machines of the modern era. But Gus treated it with a reverence that silenced any potential mockery from the younger mechanics. He saw not a piece of junk, but a classic, a machine from an era when steel was thick and a mechanic could still diagnose a problem by sound and feel. He also saw it as a final service to his old friend, Silas. Wyatt was there every day after school. He didn't just stand and watch. He arrived in his work clothes, carrying his grandfather's old metal toolbox. Mr. Henderson had given him permission, a gesture of respect that had not gone unnoticed by the staff. Wyatt didn't get in the way. He anticipated Gus's needs, handing him the right wrench before he asked for it, cleaning parts, and most importantly, holding the flashlight steady for hours on end as the old mechanic worked deep within the machine's guts. The centerpiece of the operation was the replacement of the hydraulic pump. It was a massive, complex job. They had to bring in a mobile crane to lift the engine out of the way just to access the pump assembly. The new pump, shipped overnight from a regional warehouse at John Deere's expense, was a marvel of polished steel and intricate valving, a stark contrast to the grimy, flawed original they removed. During those long afternoons, a bond formed between the old mechanic and the young boy. Gus, a man of few words, found himself opening up to Wyatt, sharing stories about Silas. "Your granddad," Gus said one afternoon, his voice echoing in the empty engine bay. He could diagnose an engine knock from 100 yards away. Called it listening to the iron's complaint. He didn't trust computers, said they only tell you what the engineers program them to see. He trusted his hands, his ears, and that damn library of his. Gus chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. Drove the salesman crazy. He knew more about their own machines than they did. Looks like he passed that on to you. Wyatt just nodded, a shy smile on his face. He was learning more than just mechanics. He was learning about his grandfather as a man, seen through the eyes of his peers. He was piecing together a legacy that was richer and deeper than he had even imagined. The cost of the repair, as Henderson had predicted, was staggering. The final invoice, which Henderson showed to Wyatt not with anger, but with a kind of awed resignation, came to just over $58,000. All of it was billed directly to John Deere's corporate warranty department. Meanwhile, the fallout for Rex Thorne was swift and brutal. Frank Miller, armed with the information from Wyatt and the full backing of his own considerable influence, had hired a lawyer. A class-action lawsuit was being formed, with other farmers who had been similarly defrauded by Rex's recall scheme joining the cause. The dealership was facing a legal and financial firestorm that would cost them hundreds of thousands, if not millions, in settlements and fines. Rex Thorne had not just lost his job, he had become a pariah. He left town in the middle of the night, his career in agricultural sales finished forever. Finally, the day came when the work was done. Every fluid had been replaced, every belt tightened, every filter changed. The new pump was installed, the engine was back in place, and a new tire had been fitted. Gus had even had one of the younger mechanics give the whole machine a thorough power wash, revealing the surprisingly solid green paint beneath the years of grime. It still had its scars and dents, its history written on its skin, but it no longer looked tired. It looked ready. Gus, Wyatt, and Mr. Henderson stood before it. Gus held the key. He looked at Wyatt, then at Henderson. Henderson gave a slight nod. Gus wiped his greasy hand on his coveralls and held the key out to Wyatt. "She's yours, son," Gus said. "Start her up." Wyatt's hand trembled slightly as he took the key. It felt impossibly heavy. He climbed the ladder to the cab, the familiar vinyl of the seat greeting him like an old friend. He slid the key into the ignition. He paused, took a deep breath, and turned it. The starter whirred for a moment, then the big diesel engine coughed once, twice, and then erupted into a deep, powerful, and perfectly smooth roar. There were no rattles, no knocks, no hesitations. It was the sound of a healthy heart beating strong. It was the sound of resurrection. The sound filled the service bay, a thunderous hymn to good iron and honest work. From the ground, Wyatt could see Gus grinning from ear to ear, a rare and beautiful sight. Getting the combine home was the next challenge. It was too big to drive on the road without permits and an escort. But the community, which had been watching this saga unfold, stepped in. Frank Miller, who now considered Wyatt something of a hero, arranged for a lowboy trailer and a truck from his own operation. 2 other neighboring farmers showed up to help guide the massive machine onto the trailer. It was a community effort, a collective endorsement of the boy and what he represented. The journey home was a triumphant parade. People came out of their houses to watch the old green giant roll by. It was more than just a piece of farm equipment. It was a symbol. It was Silas Carver's last combine, coming home where it belonged. When they finally pulled into the long gravel driveway of Wyatt's home, his mother was standing on the porch, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. As they carefully unloaded the machine, positioning it in the yard next to the workshop where its story began, she ran to Wyatt and wrapped him in a fierce hug. "Oh, Wyatt," she whispered into his hair, "your grandfather would be so proud." Wyatt hugged her back, the lump returning to his throat. He looked at the combine, standing tall and proud in the afternoon sun, then at the workshop, the sanctuary where his armor had been forged. He was home. They were all home. But the story wasn't over. Owning a combine was one thing, running a business with it was another. Wyatt, with the practicality he had inherited from Silas, knew that the machine needed to earn its keep. That fall, as the wheat fields turned to gold, he put his plan into action. He didn't try to compete with the big operators like AgriCorp. He focused on the smaller family farms, the ones with 100 acres here, 200 there, the ones the big outfits often overlooked. His first customer was Frank Miller, a symbolic gesture that sent a powerful message to the rest of the county. On the first day of the harvest, Wyatt drove the 9,500 out to Miller's fields. He was nervous, his hands sweating on the controls. This was no longer a test or a repair. This was the real thing. He lowered the grain head, engaged the threshers, and eased the machine into the standing wheat. The combine came alive, its components working in a symphony of mechanical precision. The wheat fell before the sickle bar, was drawn into the threshing cylinder, the grain separated from the chaff, and a clean golden stream began to pour into the massive grain tank. He worked all day from sunrise to sunset, his focus absolute. He drove with a skill and care that belied his years, leaving clean straight lines and losing not a single bushel to spillage. Frank Miller stood at the edge of the field, watching him, a thermos of coffee in his hand. He saw not a boy playing on a big machine, but a professional at work. He saw the legacy of Silas Carver, alive and well, cutting through his fields. Word of Wyatt's skill and his meticulously maintained machine spread quickly. He was reliable, he was fair, and his work was impeccable. Soon, he had more requests for custom harvesting than he could handle. He worked weekends and every day after school, the roar of his combine becoming a familiar and welcome sound across the valleys. He used the money he earned not for frivolous things, but to invest back into the business. He bought a used grain truck and then a better header for the combine. He was building an enterprise, one honest day's work at a time. He never forgot the source of his success. Every evening, after a long day in the field, he would return to the workshop. He would spend an hour or more with the combine, blowing off the dust, checking the fluid levels, greasing the fittings. And then he would go to the heavy workbench, open the binder for the 9,500, and, in his own neat, blocky handwriting, he would make his entry for the day. The hours run, the acres harvested, the fuel consumed. He was continuing his grandfather's gospel. Years passed. Wyatt grew from a lanky boy into a tall, strong young man. His business, Carver Custom Harvesting, thrived. He bought a second combine and then a third. He hired his first employee, a young man from a neighboring town who was eager to learn. But he never sold the 9,500. It remained the flagship of his fleet, a reminder of where he came from and the lessons he had learned. It was his touchstone, his symbol of integrity. One crisp autumn afternoon, nearly a decade after that fateful day in the showroom, Wyatt was in the workshop, tuning up the old 9,500 for the upcoming harvest. The door creaked open, and a teenager stood silhouetted in the doorway. He was about 15, skinny, with a nervous energy and an intense, intelligent look in his eyes. He was holding a worn, spiral-bound notebook. "Mr. Carver?" the boy asked, his voice hesitant. "Just Wyatt," he replied, smiling as he wiped his hands on a rag. He saw a mirror of his younger self standing there. My name is Leo," the boy said. "My family, we just bought a small piece of land up on the ridge. We got an old tractor with it, a 4020. It's not running right. The hydraulics are weak. I've been trying to figure it out, but..." He trailed off, looking down at his notebook, which was filled with sketches and notes. "Someone in town said... They said you were the person to ask. They said you know these old machines better than anyone." Wyatt looked at the boy, at his earnest face, his grease-stained fingers, his notebook filled with questions. He saw the spark, the same hunger for knowledge that his grandfather had seen in him. The circle was completing itself. He put down his wrench and walked over to the sacred shelves, where the binders stood in their neat, colorful rows. He ran his finger along the spines until he found the one he was looking for. He pulled it down. The label, in Silas Carver's faded but clear handwriting, read, "J.D. 4020 Tractor." He carried the heavy binder over to the workbench and laid it open. The pages were filled with his grandfather's notes, with decades of wisdom and experience. "All right, Leo," Wyatt said, his voice taking on the same patient, instructional tone his grandfather had used with him all those years ago. "Let's start at the beginning. Tell me what you hear. Tell me what the iron is telling you." He tapped a finger on the open page of the binder, a page detailing the intricacies of the 4020's hydraulic system. The boy, Leo, leaned in, his eyes wide with a mixture of reverence and excitement. The lesson was beginning again. The knowledge was being passed from one pair of hands to the next. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. The old John Deere 9,500 stood silent and watchful, its faded green paint glowing in the golden light. It was more than a machine. It was a monument to the simple, unshakable truth that arrogance and greed make a lot of noise, but they are always, eventually, silenced. They are silenced by the quiet, diligent work of those who do their homework. They are silenced by the weight of a promise kept. Because in the end, in the fields and in the workshops, in the ledgers and in life, it is knowledge that has the final, unyielding word.